Thank you much, Sue, for that very generous introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Cardiff. I haven't been here for a few years, and enormously impressed with your wonderful facilities and even more with the wonderful people that inhabit them. So, and a lot of people interested, I know, in neurodevelopmental disorders, as I am. So I'm going to discuss why different things co-occur that are often conceptually kept quite distinct. And Sue says, well, I'm going to tell you the answer. I'm not sure that I am, but I'm certainly going to tell you how we're looking at it and the way to think about this, I think. But first of all, obviously, I have to define what do I mean by a neurodevelopmental disorder. And there's really two types of meaning in the literature for this, one of which is referring to disorders which we know the cause of, which impact on neurodevelopment. And a good example in genetics would be Williams syndrome, and an example with an acquired cause would be fetal alcohol syndrome. In both cases, you have some sort of pattern of cognitive and behavioural problems that clearly has a neurological basis. I'm actually not going to be talking about that, so I hope nobody's too disappointed. Leave immediately if you are. Because what I'm going to talk about is the other sense of neurodevelopmental disorders, which is where there's abnormal neurodevelopment, but you don't actually know, you're in fact inferring that there's abnormal neurodevelopment because you don't know any particular cause. It looks as if the causes, I'll say a bit more about this, but they're complex and, or in some cases unknown. And this covers this whole panoply of conditions where they're really defined in terms of the behaviour that you observe. So this would include a developmental dyslexia, autistic disorder, specific language impairment, developmental coordination disorder, developmental dyscalculia, and ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So these are a whole cluster of things, which many of you may have not heard of all of them. Some are more well known than others, but they have certain characteristics in common. And one thing is that you may have noticed, they all sound rather medical. Not all of them, but most of them sound rather medical. So terms like dyslexia, dyspraxia is sometimes used for developmental coordination disorder, dyscalculia, and sometimes language impairments are referred to as dysphasia. And this is really just historical. It comes from when people first noticed that children could have these rather specific problems with aspects of cognitive functioning that rather mimicked what you sometimes see after acquired brain injury. But they are actually now, these more medical terms are quite controversial, and many people would argue against them and argue that they're quite confusing. I'm not going to dive into that debate today, and I will sometimes use these terms, but it's certainly, you have to use them cautiously because these are not really very close parallels to neurological disorders in adults. But they're defined in terms of the observed behaviour rather than any particular cause, and indeed there doesn't seem to be any one major cause in most cases. Interestingly, most of these things affect boys more than girls, sometimes by quite a marked degree, and also they tend to run in families. But are they distinct disorders? So if you read any neurodevelopmental textbook, it will tend to present them as if they are, as if these are different things, indeed some things that you might need to distinguish between if you have a child who comes along who seems to be not developing as they should. Well, the answer, if you look at the empirical data, is clearly they are massively overlapping in that many children have more than one of these problems. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from the literature, but there are many more that I could refer to. But this is a study done in Canada by Bonnie Kaplan, who's particularly interested in what's known as DCD, which is basically motor impairment developmental coordination disorder. And what was interesting about this study is she wanted to see how common this was in children with dyslexia and or ADHD. And she recruited quite a large sample of children from various clinics and special schools, and on the basis that they had either dyslexia and or ADHD. Gave them a very comprehensive assessment, including indeed for psychiatric disorders, and found that that in addition to there being a lot of overlap, which I can show here between the ADHD cases and the dyslexia cases, there were many cases that had both, but then a very high proportion of them also met her criteria for developmental coordination disorder, particularly those that had both dyslexia and ADHD. So clearly these things are often going together, and it led them to, her and Jeff Gilger, to write a paper called, where they said comorbidity, i.e. co-occurrence of disorders, is the rule, not the exception. And it's a very interesting paper, well worth reading. This is just another example that adopted a slightly different approach by Murray Dyck in Western Australia. So he got a large sample of children who were developing typically, and then also recruited children with a whole range of disorders, with autistic spectrum disorder, with what he referred to as mental retardation, which we would understand here as learning disability, with language disorders, developmental coordination disorder, and ADHD. And what he did was to say, if these are really distinct disorders and we give these children a very comprehensive battery of different measures of different aspects of mental functioning, what we should find is that we should be able to identify little clusters of children who are more similar to each other, and then there should be what he described as points of rarity between these clusters where you wouldn't see so many children. And to try and do this, he did a fancy statistical technique known as discriminant function analysis, which maximally separates any groups that you have specified. But he found that far from there being all these different clusters emerging, there were actually just basically 2 dimensions on which groups varied. And one of these dimensions, this horizontal dimension, corresponded very much to whatever's measured by an IQ test, because most of the children down this end were the ones who had been in the mental retardation group. And then this other dimension seemed to pick up something about the contrast between having social impairments of autism and the more general language impairments of language disorder. But the main point about this slide is that what he failed to find was any points of rarity or clear clustering here. On the contrary, it was clear that these are blue squares are the middle point for each of these groups, and then the blobs are the individual children with these different diagnoses. But you can see they're pretty close together, and there's a lot of overlap in the groups here, which is again just confirming that typically children who have one of these conditions are going to also have characteristics of one of the others. Now, there's a boring explanation for this, which, if true, could make this a very short talk. And this is something that's been well known in the field of medicine for many years, known as Bergson's paradox. It's the fact that if you recruit from a clinic, you tend to get people with multiple problems. And the logic is really that you could say the likelihood of going to a clinic is going to be related to how severe a particular problem is, in a sort of probabilistic way. But if that's the case, then you could say that for any particular level of, say, language impairment, here's somebody who's a 1 standard deviation below the mean, then you might expect that some of them will go to the clinic and some of them will not. But if that's also true of motor impairment, basically if you've got the conjoint problem of both motor impairment and language impairment, you're more likely to turn up in the clinic, just by sheer probability computations, let alone the fact that you might be driving your parents considerably more mad than otherwise would if you had only one of these. So this could be just what's known as an ascertainment bias. It's how you ascertain your sample, how you recruit people, could lead to quite heavy bias in who you get in your sample, and that's always an issue for people working with developmental disorders. So what you really need to test whether there is an association is to look at an entire population that's relatively unselected and then see how far these things go together. And this is just one example from a study that I did with my research assistant Annie Brookman a couple of years ago, where we happened to have a lot of data on a large, relatively normal sample of children, and we were able to look at motor skills and reading. And this is, to just say motor is actually pretty gross. There was various tests that we were using, which I won't go into here, but one thing that was clear to us is that although the relationship was pretty weak, there was still a significant association between how they performed on in these two areas. So it's a big sample, so a correlation of 0.25 is quite statistically powerful. But it's not strong, but it's still there. So, and children in the bottom down here are the ones with both problems. But you can get children who have major problems with motor task, but have actually above average reading, like these cases, or the other way around. So it's far from perfect. The other example that I want to use is between autism and language impairment. So I'm sure I probably don't need to tell this audience about autism. So autistic spectrum disorder, as it's now known, where you have impairments in communication and social interaction and behavioural repertoire. Whereas in specific language impairment, according to the textbooks, you have language not developing as normal, and you exclude cases where there's an obvious cause, like hearing loss or physical abnormality, acquired brain damage. Child is, broadly speaking, developing normally in other areas, and in most of these children, the problems are predominantly with phonology, which is speech sounds, getting your speech sounds accurate, and syntax, sentence construction. But they're quite variable, these children. So if you read a textbook, it will not only tell you these are separate disorders, but it will also suggest that it's very important to separate them. But when you look at reality, there's many children who seem to have features of both. So there was a study, one of the first studies to draw attention to this was by Helen Tager-Flussberg and Kilgard in 2003, who gathered a sample of, I think it was about 80 children with autism spectrum disorder, and just gave them a battery of tests that would normally be used to diagnose specific language impairment, and found that 76% of them met criteria for autism spectrum disorder. And there were quite a lot, so either they were impaired or they were looking borderline, as shown here, on this widely used language battery. That could be open to some sort of selection bias. So it's interesting also to look at an epidemiological sample, which was part of the SNAP cohort in London, where they screened a whole load of children, and this was trying to find out the frequency of autism in the population. So they had quite a large number, and they pulled out the cases who had autism spectrum disorder but normal non-verbal IQ, and found that 57% of them had evidence of language impairment. So this is more than half children with autism would also meet conventional criteria for language impairment. And what happens, in fact, what you're told to do by the rules of some of the classification schemes is that you would therefore diagnose them as autistic, because you would say you can't have both these diagnoses. But in a sense, if you do that, you're clearly missing something. So what interests me is, why are these things associated? For example, could it be that motor impairment causes reading impairment? Doesn't seem terribly plausible. It's perhaps more plausible that being autistic might cause a language impairment, or even that a language impairment, having a language impairment could cause autism. But generally, these sorts of pure causal associations, where one thing has led to the other, don't seem terribly plausible, simply because in all of these cases you find, I've shown them here, this is for the motor and reading example, but in these blue dot areas are the ones where the association breaks down completely. So you've got quite sizable numbers of children who are good at one and bad at the other. So although in general they go together, you can find enough exceptions to make it clear that there's not some inevitable relationship between the two. So generally, you've just got too many cases of dissociation between problems to be explained in a simple causal model. And I'd say in the case of motor and reading skills, it's not very plausible anyway, although I know there are attempts sometimes to improve dyslexia by training motor skills. Personally, I find that not a sensible approach. So it suggests rather that what we're probably looking at is a situation whereby there is something, which at the moment is the mysterious factor X, which causes both motor impairment and reading impairment, but without one actually directly influencing the other. But at what level are we talking about an overlap? Because this is a horrendously complicated diagram, and perhaps deliberately so, because I think it is horrendously complicated. Many of us, when we first came into this area and became aware of, for example, the fact that some of these disorders run in families, had a very simple mental model that we would find a gene that, if mutated, caused some sort of brain difficulty, which if then would lead on to some sort of cognitive deficit, which would then lead on to something like dyslexia. This is simply not how it works. It's much, much, much more complicated, and it's beginning to look as if really there are multiple relationships between each of these levels. So, for example, the level of etiology, we're talking about genes that might confer some kind of risk, and I've only put 3 here, but there's going to be many, many more than that. There's also what I'm calling environmental factors, aspects of the family home, whether you have particular diseases, what sort of schooling you get. These could all also have an effect. And they may affect how various regions of the brain are developing, and then that might affect different cognitive operations that you can carry out, and that will impact on your observed behaviour at the end. But these are typically many-to-one relationships and involve things adding together rather than just one single line. And so if we're saying that, for example, autism and language impairment overlap, they could be overlapping because there's some basic cognitive process that's involved in both. They could overlap because there's some brain region which is important in both, or because there's some genes or environmental factors that affect. And it's really a case of how on earth are we going to unscramble this very, very complicated picture. I'm going to talk about 2 approaches. There's more that you can use, but the 2 that I've most focused on is to say one way is to try and get a handle on the fact that these are disorders that run in families and where there's evidence of a genetic contribution. But what you can then do is look at family members as well as the person with the particular disorder themselves. The other thing you can do is to take a much more detailed look at what we call the phenotype, the actual presenting features, rather than just saying somebody has dyslexia, somebody has language impairment. Let's try and drill down and say, where are the similarities between conditions? Is it particular aspects of the person that are person's difficulties that are correlated? So I'm going to illustrate this with the example specifically. I know people here are particularly interested in autism, so I thought I'd use the example of autistic spectrum disorder and specific language impairment. Specific language impairment is very much what I work on, but partly because of all these overlaps, I've been sort of forced to be, Sue was very kind saying I've made important contributions to autism, but it's not really my main area. I came into autism through language impairment, which is perhaps an unusual route. But I was continually seeing children who were questioning the boundaries between these 2 labels. Now, the first thing to say, to give a bit of background to both conditions, is that in both autism and specific language impairment, there's evidence that the etiology, the causation, fundamental causation, is complex and multifactorial. And I said that in an earlier slide. It's complicated, but that's not just me waving my hand and saying it's complicated. It's that there's evidence it's complicated. And one bit of evidence is just, okay, it runs in families, but how does it run in families? Most people who have learnt any genetics will have learnt their genetics with Mendel's peas being a wonderful example. So there was Gregor Mendel in his monastery breeding different sorts of peas and showing that whether they had wrinkly or smooth skin or whether they were yellow or green, showed wonderfully clear patterns of inheritance. And you can, for some human conditions, show similar patterns going through families, either a dominant gene, in which case 50% of the offspring of somebody affected will also have it, or a recessive gene. These give you very distinctive patterns, but in these conditions that's not the case. If, for example, if I've got specific language impairment, there's something like 25% chance that I'll have a first degree, a relative, that is a sibling or a parent with a similar condition, but it doesn't run through the family in a clear-cut way. And this is not particularly unusual. We're now recognising that there's an awful lot of medical conditions that are exactly the same. Asthma, high blood pressure, various aspects of heart disease. These are all things which have a contribution from genetics, but it's complicated. It seems to be multifactorial. The other thing that's interesting about these conditions is that they're not all or none. So it's not, for many years, autism was thought to be something where you either had it or you didn't have it. And I think increasingly it's been recognised, and largely through studying families, that it's possible to have sort of like pale, well in this case pale blue autism. So this is I just nicked this off the internet as a picture, but it illustrates the point that it's saying that rarely you will have some people who have autism with all the clinical manifestations, Other people may have a paler version where they show some of the features but not all. And then other people, it's really very, very mild indeed, but you can still perhaps see some evidence of autistic-like features, which in fact, if in very mild form, might be beneficial. For example, it's been argued that being highly focused, being able to be highly focused on a particular task may actually confer benefits. So in both autism and SLI, there's evidence for this, that if you look at family members, you find that they may have some features in common without meeting diagnostic criteria. So that's another sign of something being potentially multifactorial. And also, they're genetically incredibly complicated, we know, because we tried looking at them with simple genetic models and it just hasn't worked. So there was great optimism in about the 1980s, 90s, and people were doing twin studies. I did a twin study of specific language impairment. Other people were doing twin studies. In fact, I was following the footsteps of Susan Falstein and Mike Rutter, who did a twin study of autism, a very small one in those days. But basically, I think everybody was very impressed by the results of these twin studies, because I won't take you through great detail about the method, but for those of you not familiar with the logic, it's simply that we have this wonderful natural experiment. We have identical monozygotic twins who are genetically the same, and then you've got dizygotic fraternal twins who are like regular brothers and sisters and have on average half their segregating genes, the genes that differ between people, the same. We're only looking at twins growing up together. People often say, how do you find all these twins separated at birth? No, we're not. We're looking at twins growing up together. So they are exposed to many of the same influences, and you would expect them to resemble each other for that reason. But the evidence for a genetic contribution is if the monozygotic twins resemble each other much more than the dizygotic twins. And that particular result comes out time and time again when you do studies with both specific language impairment and autism. So everybody thought, well, it's clear that genetics are really important for these conditions, and let's rush off and find the genes. And then they came back and found that it was really very difficult. And originally, people thought it might just be that it was this huge amount of material to search through in the genome. Maybe we're just looking in the wrong place. But I think now it's more often recognized that it's much more likely that the genetic influences don't involve, again, the traditional sort of condition that we think of as a genetic condition, where you have a mutation that gives you a disease. There may be some cases of autism where that is true. In fact, we know there are some, but it's not the usual cause. It's much more likely that there are what we would call risk factors, or versions of genes that just make you that little bit more susceptible. And if you've only got 1 or 2 or 3 of them, it wouldn't really make any difference. If you've got 10, 20 of these susceptibility factors, you might then start to be moving into that clinical range. So you've got a lot of factors all combining, any one of which is quite small, and that makes them very hard to find. So, where do we go then in trying to explain this overlap? We know that both conditions are probably multifactorial. We know that traditionally they've been regarded as separate, yet this model of separate disorders doesn't seem to explain why they should co-occur. The way I'm modelling this is very simple. This is, for those of you into the technical side of things, this is based on Faulkner's very early modelling of things like cleft palate, where he argued that you can have a genetic risk, and what it does is it doesn't just either give you a disorder or not, it will affect where you are on this continuum. So this is a normal distribution, and we would really identify you as having a problem. I have switched his scale. He would say if you've got a high liability, but I'm showing it here as low on this scale, which could, because this is more like a measure of language, underlying language ability. If you're low enough, we'll say you've got specific language impairment. But the idea is that the underlying factor is actually quite continuous, and there may be people who just fall above or below that threshold. Exactly the same sort of model for autism, only because it's rarer, the cutoff is more extreme. Now, when I say we know they're not really independent, I've already shown you evidence that they tend to co-occur. How could that happen if they were independent? It simply couldn't, because you can work out how likely it would be for two things to co-occur just by chance on the basis of very simple probability theory. We know that SLI affects about, depends how you define it exactly, but about 7 per 100 children. ASD is reckoned now to be about 1 per 100 children. But that means that if, just by chance, you happen to be unlucky enough to have two together, it should affect only about 7 per 10,000 children, whereas we've shown that in children with autism, about 50% of them have also got language impairment. So this is really not going to work as a model. We have to abandon the idea they're totally separate. So the key question is that, of course, although they're not totally separate, there also definitely are cases where they can separate. That's the killer, really. You sort of try and explain why they go together, but then you feel you've got to also explain why they don't always go together. So how are we going to explain this pattern of association? And I want to argue that there's two sort of approaches, and as I mentioned before, one of them is to look more carefully at the phenotype. That is the actual pattern of impairments that you see. And one of the things I've particularly been interested in focusing on is this very simple little test of non-word repetition, which is so simple. It's simple to do and to describe, but it's actually quite complicated to work out what on earth it really is measuring. But you just go up to a child and you say things like hampant, doppelate. In fact, you present this over headphones, but confrantually and pristeractional. They sound like words, but they aren't, although they start to enter your vocabulary if you give this test long enough. But what happens is they just have to repeat it back to you, and you're interested in how accurately they do that. And this is a very well now established result that in children with language impairments who are shown in blue, with a control group in pink, they do fine if you've got two-syllable non-words, but then the longer the non-words get, the bigger the gap opens up between the two groups. So this is by many people regarded as a test of a sort of memory system for remembering speech sounds, and which would be important for learning new words. And it's a nice, simple test, and it's very sensitive to a specific language impairment. There's been a whole load of studies and taken into a meta-analysis here, confirming that you get a nice big difference between language impaired and other children on this. But what's so interesting about it, and where it starts to get helpful for perhaps understanding comorbidity, is that when you look at parents, you get different results depending on whether you're looking at SLI or autism. So in children with SLI, we've done studies looking, well, I've also shown the same with twin studies, where you're looking at people who are either genetically identical or strongly related. What you do find is it's just very clearly familial. We'll find that the parents of children with SLI often are poor at non-word repetition, even though they may themselves not have any really obvious language problems. We again get back to this notion of a sort of rather broader phenotype. And that has now been shown enough times that I think we're fairly confident that that's a meaningful result. So when I was working in Western Australia, I had an opportunity to do something very similar in families with a child with autism, part of a big Western Australian autism study. And they were all given a test of non-word repetition. And to my great surprise, I really expected we'd find the same thing, but we didn't. We found that although the children with autism themselves were often very bad at non-word repetition, their parents weren't. And in fact, there was, I think, no correlation between the parents and the child's level of ability on this task. And then we also had siblings, and again, they were in general not impaired on this task. So this really makes you think, well, are they really overlapping, or are they just looking as if they're overlapping? So this is a sort of model which I have termed a Phenomimicry model, to give it a fancy name, which is simply that two things that may look alike may in fact be quite different from each other if you measure them in the right way. You may be able to find this dissociation. And the idea would be that you can have risk factors for SLI, risk factors for autism, but the very fact that you've got autism may make you not so good on language tasks, and in particular, it could be argued maybe it's to do with the fact that this particular task involves imitation, which is known to be something that children with autism are not good at. And the interesting thing about this is it could explain why they appear to go together. It would argue that they don't really if you measure them properly, but it would also explain why you don't get any problems in the relatives, because the relatives would have the same risk factors up here of children with autism, but they wouldn't have that path present. And there's a little bit of evidence that does seem to go along with this, at least as far as non-word repetition is concerned. And it is only a little bit, and this, I think we need more. But what we have here is this effect I showed before. It's unfortunately plotted as errors rather than correct, just to confuse you and keep you awake. High is bad on this graph, and again you see that in children with language impairment, the number of errors goes up as the non-word gets longer. Much less so for children with autism. But this was a small sample both of children and of non-words, so it was a rather post hoc analysis we did, but I think it started making us think that maybe there are differences in the nature of the language problems. And then David Williams has done some similar work on children with autism and SLI, but in this case he's looking at the nature of the errors they make when they misrepeat non-words, and he used some very carefully crafted non-words where they could vary in different places in the non-word, and I can never remember these non-words, but they're things like frist, or no, I can't do it, fristy, I don't know. They could either have a cluster, which would be something like fr or tr, or several sounds together in the beginning or in the middle. Fitry would be, I suppose, one with a medial cluster. And what they found was that whereas children with specific language impairment were much worse when there was a medial cluster, this was not the case again for children with autism. So it really did seem to suggest that there are some qualitative differences that wouldn't be picked up if you just take a total test score here. But I don't feel this can be the whole answer, and I feel there may still be more, simply because we still don't understand why it's only some children with autism who have these problems with non-word repetition. The obvious thing would be that it might just be a function of severity of autism, but that was banged on the head by this study by Lindgren, who did one of probably the most thorough studies of this topic in children with autism and with specific language impairment. And what they're comparing here are children who they call ALN, autism with normal language, so they don't look like cases of SLI, or children who have autism with what looks like SLI. And as you can see, there's really a high again is bad here. These are scores on the ADIR, so the more impaired you are, the higher your scores. But there's very little difference between these, and certainly no statistically reliable difference on any of the three domains of functioning, which is fascinating because it just means that it's not the most severe children who have these language difficulties. So I think we need to continue to look at other explanations. I think that phenomimicry may be part of the story, but perhaps not the whole story. And another possibility that is very interesting to people in this field is the idea that it might be that you've got risk factors which are actually correlated together, so that the risk factors co-occur and lead to children having both conditions. You could have some genes, so if we're saying there's lots and lots of genes here that confer a risk for SLI and lots of different genes that confer a risk for autism, there might be a few that manage to confer a risk for both, something known as pleiotropy. There could also be genes that are just sufficiently close together on the chromosome that they tend to be inherited together. You could also have environmental risk factors that affect both conditions, so maybe growing up in poverty would increase your risk of both conditions, or other factors we might be able to think of that could work that way. And there could also be, this is an intriguing one, that what happens is you find that people with communication problems, be it language impairment or autism, tend to get together and have children together, in which case they would be producing children who had both those risk factors. So it's fascinating when you think about these different options, but they're very, very hard to tease apart. Just to take one example of where people are nowadays thinking how this might work, there's a gene which everybody calls catnap, although it's actually which is a big gene where individual people vary quite a lot in the precise DNA sequence of this gene. And that's the sort of gene that you really want if you're trying to explain differences between people, so that you can see whether the differences in the form the gene takes relate to differences between the people. And this one has attracted a lot of interest as a gene that might give you a risk for autism and as a gene that might give you a risk for SLI. And this fascinated me because it made me think maybe this is one of these candidates for something that could actually affect both these conditions. Whereas what tends to happen in the literature is people are so fixated on these being different conditions that they used to get into arguments as to which condition it really was a gene for. I think it may be that that's not the way to think about it. But there are these studies, I won't bore you with the details of all of them, but starting with a study that suggested that a particular version of this gene is associated with late language development in autism spectrum disorder, and then a big study on non-word repetition, my favourite task in SLI, showing an association between versions of this gene. Another one done in China, late language, 2 studies there, one in a normal population. So this is all looking quite promising, but it's very, very important to be clear that we're not talking about a mutation causing a disorder. We're talking about very common variants. There'll be sort of probably about a third of the people in this room would have this risk version of catnap, and the effect it would have would be very, very small in any one individual, probably average out, so small that without assessing you formally it would be hard to pick it up. And it's very important to realise that, and the effect sizes are so small, it means that you can only actually detect these things with very, very big samples, and many of these effects that have been described in the literature don't replicate when you run another sample, and I wouldn't be impressed with this except that there seem to be enough independent samples where something's coming out, but at the same time it's very important to realise how small these effects are. So I felt that it would be interesting to try and model that situation using simulated data to try and say, could it actually, that sort of catnap approach, the idea that there is a gene that affects both these disorders, could that actually explain what we're seeing in terms of patterns of impairment in relatives and co-occurrence of disorders? And basically it really couldn't. It could either explain one of those things or the other, but not both. You could tweak your simulated data whichever way you wanted, but it was very hard to get a model that would simultaneously predict that your relatives shouldn't, of those with autism, shouldn't show this deficit in non-word repetition, while the relatives of those with SLI did. If you could explain that, then you couldn't explain the co-occurrence in the children. The only way I could get this model, which was, say, a sort of simulated set of data to produce anything that looked like what we actually see in real life, was by assuming that there were actually interactions between genes. And this is basically what the model is saying, is that you may have, this would be 3, you could either have 1 or 2 copies of this risk version of this gene, and the effect that it has if you don't have any autism risk genes is very minor, as I've been saying, but if it's combined with a gene that gives you a risk for autism, the idea is that the effect gets much, much more severe on your language skills. That actually, is very much post hoc massaging simulated data to tell us, to get us something that is close to what we actually see, and it's certainly not proven to be the right result. But it's actually surprisingly hard to do any other sort of modelling that will come out with something that looks like the right result. So I was quite happy to find that this model did seem to predict the high frequency of comorbidity and the fact that relatives were less affected in cases of autism. And it also fits very nicely, and geneticists have got to the point where they're moving away from just looking at one gene and one variant of a gene, but rather looking at how genes work together in networks to have particular effects. And this is a diagram from a recent study that did focus very much on catnap and on other genes. In fact, that's catnap1 in that system, but they all sort of interact together to have particular effects. And people are starting to say that's what we should be looking at, that's more likely to be fruitful. So that's where I'm sort of been going with trying to understand the combination of autism and language impairment. It does seem that it's complicated, and that to some extent it might be that having autism does make you poor on certain language tasks, but for different reasons from language impaired children, but that in addition there might be some evidence that having 2 risks, having a sort of double hit of both having an autism risk gene and something that would normally give you just a very mild language risk, has a much more detrimental effect than either one alone. I want to just use the last 5 minutes, though, to change tack slightly, to talk about the implications of all of this overlap for real life and for people who are sort of seeing these children clinically. So what I've really depicted is a situation rather like this, where everything overlaps with everything else. And I mean, one of these days when I have enough time, it would be quite interesting to trawl through the literature and work out these various percentages. This is just a notional Venn diagram, but it's certainly the case that you can find evidence for overlap between, say, DCD and ADHD, dyslexia and ADHD, dyslexia and SLI, SLI and ASD, and so it goes. They are definitely not these very clear-cut disorders that the textbooks would have us believe. And the clinical implication of this is quite worrying, because what often happens, I think, is that the diagnosis a child gets is more a function of the specialist that they see than of their particular pattern of problems. So that you get, I mean, I have in fact seen cases where the parent has been desperately trying to get somebody to diagnose their child, and they go to an ed psych who says they have dyslexia, they go to a speech and language therapist who says they have SLI, a psychiatrist thinks they've got autistic spectrum disorder, a neurologist thinks they've got developmental coordination disorder, and a paediatrician says they've got ADHD. And they come to me and they say, who's going to tell me the truth? And of course the truth is that the child probably has features of all of these, but each of these professionals is looking at them through their own particular lens. The problem of this is that not just that parents get incredibly confused, but that also I think we miss out on the full picture with a lot of children when we do assessments. Some labels dominate and they might give you access to services. So you find a lot of parents wanting a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder if in the place where they live that has good services for children with autism. But on the other hand, that child may have attentional problems or may have motor problems that are completely overshadowed by this diagnosis of autism, and nobody will be looking at that. When I talked about this recently elsewhere, somebody drew my attention to Chris Gilberg making very similar arguments, what he calls essence. I mean, he writes excellent stuff, but he does have dreadful acronyms. Early symptomatic syndromes eliciting neurodevelopmental clinical examinations, whoa. But he's saying the same thing, essentially, that these things go together, and instead of trying to pull them apart, we're really doing children a disservice by failing to recognise that. We're also sort of distorting the research literature. This is just some figures on how many, I did a bibliometric survey of how many research papers were written about all of these different disorders. And here they're rank ordered in terms of how frequent the disorder is reckoned to be. And this is the number of papers per year over this, I think, 25-year period. And what you see is that there's a massive amount of research on autism and ADHD, and much less on some other conditions, like very little on developmental dyscalculia, not much on developmental coordination disorder, even though these are relatively common. And interestingly, specific language impairment and ADHD are very similar in terms of frequency, and we also got people to rate how severe the impact of these disorders was on the person's life. And ADHD and SLI were really very similar in that regard, yet there's 8 times more papers on ADHD. So it's become like the top disorder, but I feel personally the more we look at those kids with ADHD, we find that they've got all sorts of other problems. And this is just on funding as well. As you can see, the funding for autism research, this is in the United States, has overtaken ADHD and skyrocketed. This is all these other conditions, dyslexia, SLI, speech disorders, dyscalculia, DCD together, that's how much funding they get. So we've become sort of too focused on 1 or 2 labels and not recognising, I think, the full picture. What's the alternative? I mean, Gilberg would say we should be recognising essence, and I think he's right, only I wouldn't call it that. But I would say we could talk about neurodevelopmental disability, which would be a very broad category, including loads of stuff, but you wouldn't stop there. You would supplement it then. Once you'd established that the child fell in that broad category, you would be assessing the entire profile of strengths and difficulties in a multidisciplinary way, knowing that a child who fell in that category would probably have more than one area of difficulty. So just to close, this is really just me making a plug for this rally campaign that Sue mentioned at the outset. So I feel that language impairments have been rather neglected, perhaps in part because of a focus on talking about specific language impairment as if it's some particular syndrome, which it certainly isn't. It seems to be that language impairment is very much something that can accompany a whole range of other disorders, but it's very under-recognised. And we are trying to improve that. A group of us, myself, Gina Conti-Ramsden, Maggie Snowling, Courtney Norbury and Becky Clark, and we've started this YouTube channel with very short videos to try and explain what it is that we're talking about. We do still use the term here, specific language impairment, because it's the one that's widely known. But we're in the moment in a lot of debate about terminology as well, and whether that is the best way to describe what we're interested in. But I think that's all I have to say, and I'll leave a bit of time for questions. Thanks.